One of the things that I'm going to do, a lot of the talks that we had this morning were really focused on the river itself. This talk is really going to sort of broaden our conversation about water quality, hopefully, and start talking about different scales of planning and the way that we think about water quality. And also to give you some examples of some of the tools we might be able to develop and use to target areas for restoration and then also conservation through the lens of improving water quality. So we learned a lot this morning about the river and river health, and I think most people in this room know and understand that watersheds, like Stephanie talked about, they're these big systems where everything that happens contributes downstream, and we see the effects of what's happening upstream throughout the watershed. And for people, the question earlier this morning was, what is good water quality? And I think for most people, if you can answer the question, can you drink it? Is it safe to eat the fish? Can I swim in it? Those are the sorts of things that really resonate with people. And so when we think about watershed health and water quality, we immediately think about things like the odor of the water, whether or not the water is safe to drink. And we've had increasingly some major issues in the province of Alberta and in the NSR with respect to issues with water quality. So blue-green algae blooms in terms of nutrients, and a lot of questions about why that's happening, because these things are changing, the watershed is changing, and a lot of people are really concerned about it. And I would argue that there are a lot of policies, Stephanie talked about this as well, did a really good job of summarizing all of the things that we have in terms of policy and legislation to manage watersheds and water quality. And on the other side of that, on the other side of policy and legislation, we also have a lot of folks who are out there in the watershed working. So we have WPACs, we have organizations like Cows and Fish that are restoring riparian lands. Alice is also out restoring riparian and wetlands, and Ducks Unlimited as well. And we have government programs like WRRP that give out money to restore our watersheds, and also federal, provincial partnerships like Growing Forward 2, trying to incentivize best management practices on agricultural lands. So I would argue there's a lot of things happening on the do thing side of the equation. We know that there's a problem. We have people who are out there trying to affect change. I would argue that effort to affect change oftentimes is a little bit uncoordinated. And so what I wanted to talk to you about today is this idea of targeting. If we have a limited amount of resources, which we do, both in terms of financial resources and human resources, if we want to use those resources effectively to improve water quality, how might we do that? And what tools do we need to be able to effectively do that? So one of the things that we can do in order for us to do a better job of managing water quality is something called spatial targeting. And spatial targeting allows us to target areas that require restoration or conservation more efficiently so that we're all coordinating our efforts in certain areas. And theoretically, this should produce better resources than better outcomes than a more shotgun approach. And I think water quality is a really good, it's a really good thing for us to think about through the lens of spatial targeting, because a lot of the causes of poor water quality and a lot of the things that we can do to improve water quality are highly spatial. So when we think about things that reduce water quality, we talk about intensity of land use. So we've talked a lot about point and non-point sources today. These things are spatial. We know where they are on the landscape, we can map them, and we can target areas where we know we have contributing pollution or pesticides or herbicides flowing into our creeks and streams and wetlands. We also can map things that help those point and non-point sources flow into our drinking water sources. So topography, things like steep slopes, the way water flows on the landscape, these things are also highly spatial, and we can map areas where there's risks in terms of steep slopes or areas where we see flow paths. And then land cover. Things like where is the vegetation? What type of vegetation grows there? Do we have vegetation or bare soils? Do we have riparian habitats or wetlands? These are all things that are highly spatial that help inform our understanding of water quality and then also what we might do to improve water quality. So that seems pretty maybe basic and straightforward, but doing good spatial targeting can often be really difficult, especially in the context of water quality, big river basins, lots of people, different stakeholders. So one of the really most paramount things to do good spatial targeting is clear management or policy objectives. And oftentimes this is where we get stuck because often different management approaches differ between municipalities and the provincial government. Different stakeholders might have different ideas about what management and objectives should be. And so getting everyone on the same page in terms of what we're trying to target and manage can often be a pretty difficult thing to do, but it's the most important step in spatial targeting. The other thing is really asking questions about whether or not you can tie your management objectives back to some policy objective. Because oftentimes if you have some policy support for the direction that you want to go, you can find more support from your stakeholders and then often funding to help you achieve some better outcomes. It also allows you to identify where there might be some gaps in policy, which is an important thing for us to know as we move forward and learn and adjust as we understand the landscape. And then one really critically important piece of this is the scale at which we're asking questions and applying management solutions. And what I mean by scale is at what level do we manage and think about this problem? Are we thinking about it at the provincial scale, or are we talking about it at a smaller spatial extent? And I argue that the scale must be both ecologically relevant, so it has to be relevant to the system that you're trying to manage, and it also needs to be policy relevant. And oftentimes, again, matching ecological scale and policy scale can be a difficult thing, but it's a really important thing for us to be thinking about. Scale is also really important from the perspective of the fact that depending on what scale you're working, it really drives your availability to data, which from a spatial targeting perspective, you need access to good data, and also the methods that you use. So just to illustrate this, we have a lot of tools that look at the province of Alberta. Spatially, the unit that we're thinking about is the province. But we can drill down from that fairly coarse scale to a watershed like the NSR. And within that NSR, we have different sizes of watersheds. So we call this the Huck 4 watershed, which is a hydrologic unit of how the watersheds are arranged. But we can go down in scale from a Huck 4 to a Huck 6 and down to a Huck 8. And as we go down, we get finer and finer in terms of our spatial resolution. We can also go from a river basin scale down to a Huck 6 scale. In this case, this is the Modeste watershed. And then we can target areas within that watershed, and we could look at, for example, all major streams and rivers in the Modeste, or we could just target a specific reach. And so you can imagine that if we were targeting a single reach in the Modeste watershed, our access to data, the types of questions we ask would be very different than if we were looking at the province of Alberta. And so defining scale and understanding what questions you're asking at that scale are really important. Then you have to pick targets that are meaningful in terms of the outcomes that you want to achieve. So asking questions about what are the targets, can you measure those targets directly with the data that you have, and then what are your methods for assessing those targets are really important things to be thinking about. And then data. Vanessa talked about data this morning, and this is when you're doing spatial targeting and analysis, Suitable and reliable data is critically important, and I would argue we have a bit of an issue in Alberta with reliable spatial data. So both the scale and the resolution of our data has to be appropriate to our question, and we have to have accurate and precise data. This is an example of how resolution of your data can really affect the way you can answer questions. So if you have lower, coarser data, it's harder for you to accurately delineate the things of interest that you might be trying to target. But there's a real trade-off between the scale at which you want to measure things and the resolution of the data that you can work with. So measuring things at the provincial scale with very high resolution data, unless you have a supercomputer that can do your spatial analysis, sometimes there's serious limitations to how you can actually handle data. So that's something that from a very technical perspective you have to keep in mind. This is just an example of why accurate data matters. So this is the provincial merged wetland inventory. And just to point out a few things that you need to be thinking about when you do spatial analysis. So often when you have spatial data, we have things called omission errors. So these are areas, targets on the landscape that are there in real life, but we've missed them. They're omissions in the data. We also have errors called commission errors. So these are areas on the landscape where we think our data tell us they are wetlands, but they are not wetlands. So that's a commission error. We also have boundary errors. So the accuracy of where we've delineated the targets on the ground matters. And then also we have classification errors. So in this case, this polygon is telling us it's a fen wetland when we know it's not a fen. And so these are all the different types of errors that we have to think about and understand in our data if we're going to use those data sets. And I would offer that no spatial data set is 100% accurate, but we need to, I guess, have some benchmarks for accuracy before we decide to use these data products. So there's been a lot of blah, blah, blah about spatial targeting. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about is some examples of spatial targeting that we have been involved in. So the first one, and this is a provincial scale tool that we developed for the province of Alberta, and this was for the Watershed Resilience and Restoration Project. So this is an example of a spatial targeting tool where we use the HUC6 watershed boundary as our unit of analysis. And this tool was developed for the provincial government because they created the WRRP program after the 2013 floods. And it's money that is being allocated to high priority watersheds to address issues of flooding, drought, or water quality. And so as part of this exercise, we created a spatial tool that allowed us to target or create a map, a priority map for the government. So we had the 3 different flood, drought, and water quality criteria, we called them. And underneath each of those, we have indicators. And these are indicators that we use to basically prioritize areas that we should target money to improve these conditions. So the indicators that we had included things that were categorized under hazard, consequence, or resilience. So hazard indicators were things that we knew were putting pressure on each of these criteria. A consequence are things that we wanted to minimize impacts in those watersheds. And then resilience are features, natural features in the landscape that build in capacity of those watersheds to resist the hazards. So for each of the water quality, flood, and drought, there were 3 separate maps. I'm not going to present the flood and the drought because we're here to talk about water quality. So this is the water quality map that we produced for the government. And under each of the hazard, consequence, and resilience indicators, I've listed the metrics that we actually use to measure those things. So things like, what is the average slope in the watershed? How much area downstream is developed? How much area upstream is developed? These are the sorts of things, and again, looking at a very coarse spatial extent, but that coarse spatial extent allows the government to look at these maps and say, when they get a funding proposal, how did these watersheds rate in terms of flooding, drought, and water quality? And should we be giving money to this project for water quality improvements in a watershed that doesn't really, it's not a high priority in terms of these indicators that we created. So this is an example of spatial targeting at the provincial scale. Going one sort of scale down, we can look at spatial targeting within watersheds. So Mary Ellen mentioned this, we're doing some work right now with the NSWA in the Modeste watershed to create a tool to assess riparian health and condition. And this is being done so that the NSWA and their partners can, again, start to think about where are we going to target areas on the landscape for programs like restoration or conservation. So one of the things that we're doing is looking at riparian condition from different perspectives. So what is the condition of the riparian area? And then what is the larger landscape risk in terms of water quality? So we really have these two pillars in terms of the restoration priority. The riparian condition, which is really looking at what is the condition of that riparian zone, and then the risk to water quality sort of upslope of the riparian zone. So what we've done in the Modeste watershed is we've identified, we're focusing on the major streams and the major reaches in the Modeste watershed. So we've identified the streams of interest, and we've created a 1.5 kilometer buffer on either bank of these streams. And within that buffer, we've created a new land cover layer. So land cover is a really important data input into spatial targeting. And so we've used Spot 6, which is a satellite, a 6-meter resolution satellite, to create a new up-to-date land cover for the Modeste watershed. And this land cover is being used as an input into our spatial analysis. So we're using the Spot 6 land cover in addition to other data products like the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute Human Footprint Inventory, and the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada land cover, which gives us a lot of information about agricultural production and intensity of use of different areas in the watershed. And putting all this data together then allows us to look at the condition of the right bank and the left bank of each of these streams. And we're able to produce maps that show, when we score these different indicators, do we have a good condition, a fair condition, or a poor condition in terms of riparian condition on these major reaches? And so we have that piece of the puzzle. What is the condition of the riparian? And what we're working on right now, which is currently under development, is looking at the water quality risk side of this. So you can imagine that if you have a really healthy riparian zone, but 30 meters away from that, you have an intensive livestock feeding operation, that's a different landscape context than having a riparian zone with natural vegetation adjacent to it. So we want to account for both the condition of the riparian zone and the immediate risk factors on the landscape. And the idea here is that we can combine those two scores together to give the NSWA a tool that then allows them to target their program, working with municipalities, which landowners do they identify to engage in terms of restoration programs. I'd also argue that this is a good tool for looking at areas to conserve on the landscape. We talk a lot about restoration and paying for restoration, but I think we also need to start talking about payment for ecosystem services for maintaining areas on the landscape that are healthy and are fully functional so that those persist into the future. So this matrix really, if you have poor riparian condition and a high water quality risk, those are obvious areas that you would target over other areas where you have a good riparian condition and low risk. So in terms of allocating your resources, you want to target those high priority areas. The last tool that I just want to talk about is some work that we did for Parkland County, where we created a wetland inventory for them. And this work included 4 major steps. The first 2 steps Number one was to create a current inventory. So Parkland County, a lot of counties, municipalities in the province don't actually know where their wetlands are. And so an important first step to managing areas on the landscape is to know where they are. So we created a current wetland inventory, and then for each of those wetlands that we identified, we assigned an ecological condition to those wetlands. So this is the current inventory of wetlands. There's lots of wetlands in Parkland County. Parkland County is interesting because it's in the boreal transition area, so we have a lot of marsh wetlands, but we also have a lot of peatlands, so treed wetlands, bogs, and fens. And then we took a similar approach in terms of indicators. So we have indicators of ecological condition, which included indicators of hydrologic health and water quality. And this then produces maps of wetlands that are in excellent, very good, good, moderate, or poor condition. And this is the map, the water quality, the hydrologic health and water quality map. So this allows Parkland County to understand which wetlands are high priority from a water quality perspective. So those would be areas they would target for conservation. And it also shows them where we have degraded or poorly performing wetlands, which they may then target for restoration activities. And they have a partnership with ALICE, the Alternative Land Use, I forget what ALICE stands for, but services, yeah. And they work with landowners to do riparian and wetland restoration. And so Parkland County was really interested in having a map like this to help them target landowners that they would be interested in working with. And this is the map where we aggregated all the scores. So we had the ecological criteria, we had the water quality criteria, and those were aggregated together to create a final score. The other thing that Parkland wanted us to do was to create a historic wetland inventory for them and calculate the amounts of loss in the county. And this is actually something that has never been done at this level of detail in the province of Alberta. So this is a pretty, I would say, land-breaking, brave thing for Parkland County to have done. This is the historic inventory that we created using air photos circa 1950, and I say that because the mosaic was different years. There's some major, huge challenges working with historic air photos. So this is the inventory of historic wetlands, and basically we overlaid that with the current inventory so that we could find locations on the landscape where we had complete losses of wetlands and then also partial losses of wetlands. And then we calculated the amount of change. So over that, between 1950 and 2013, which was the current year of our inventory, we saw a change in wetland area of 40,000 hectares. So a reduction in area of 40,000 hectares, which is about a 56% difference between the current and the historic. So that's a pretty major change. It's pretty consistent with other estimates of wetland loss in the province of Alberta. And it also allowed us to then split the county into some Huck 8 watersheds and tell them where were the highest rates of loss of wetland. So again, in terms of thinking about water quality, and maybe there's a spatial relationship here between rates of high wetland losses and areas where people are complaining about stinky smells in their lakes. And again, this just gives the county a lot more information to start thinking critically about how to manage water quality. And now that they know that there are issues in the county, another piece of information that they can pull in to more, better inform decisions moving forward. So in conclusion, hopefully I've presented some persuasive arguments for why, number one, good information is important. If we think areas are important and we want to manage them, we have to know where they are. So that's number one. Good inventory data is paramount to any good management decision. If we have good inventory data, then we have to assume that not all areas are equal in terms of priority. So if we take that assumption, then we need to start asking questions about where should we be targeting our actions on the landscape so that we can have a more coordinated effort, hopefully, to get some better outcomes in terms of water quality, but also biodiversity and other things like that. also, and I can't stress this enough, if you're going to do spatial targeting or any kind of conservation planning activity, really clearly defining what your objectives are. I cannot understate this enough, because that definition of what's important really drives the entire process. And if you involve stakeholders at the beginning and you all define what's important at the beginning of this exercise, then when you get to the end and you identify areas of high priority, then everyone is usually in agreement that those are areas that require action. And so I would encourage you all to think about spatial targeting.